The grand hall of the Zelfar Empire was filled with alien dignitaries, warriors, and officials. The banners of victory hung from the ceiling, golden symbols reflecting the lights from the massive chandeliers. It was a day of celebration. The war was over. The enemy had been defeated, and peace had been restored. Princess Niara, heir to the empire, stood at the center of it all. She had been raised to be a leader, to guide her people through times of crisis. But today, her duty was different. She was to meet the hero who won the war, a mysterious human warrior known as the Phantom. No one knew much about him. He had appeared when the war seemed lost, leading daring attacks, striking where the enemy least expected, and turning the tide of battle. His strategies had outsmarted even the most skilled generals. Some believed he was a ghost, a legend, not a real person. But today, he would stand before them all. Niara watched as the doors to the hall slowly opened. A hush fell over the crowd. The sound of heavy boots echoed as the warrior entered. The Phantom was taller than most humans, dressed in black battle armor, his face hidden behind a smooth helmet. His movements were strong but controlled, as if he carried the weight of many battles. Niara studied him carefully. Something about him felt strangely familiar, but she could not place it. The Emperor himself stepped forward to greet the human warrior. "You have done a great service to the Empire," the Emperor said, his voice full of respect. "Without you, we would have fallen." The Phantom nodded but said nothing. Niara stepped closer. "You have saved my people. For that, we are grateful," she said, trying to see past the helmet. There was a pause before the Phantom spoke, his voice deep and steady. It was necessary. The response was simple, yet something in his tone sent a strange feeling through Niara's chest. She had heard a voice like that before. But that was impossible. The only human she had ever been close to was Kale, her childhood friend, the boy who had lived in the palace long ago, the boy who had disappeared when the war began. She shook the thought away. Kale was gone. This warrior was someone else. The ceremony continued, but Niara couldn't focus. She kept glancing at the Phantom. His posture, the way he stood, it was like a memory from the past that she could not fully grasp. Then something happened that made her heart stop. As the Emperor handed the Phantom a medal, he spoke again. "You have earned the highest honor of the Empire, Phantom. If there is anything you wish, speak it now." The Phantom hesitated, then turned slightly toward Niara. His voice was quiet, but clear. "You are still stubborn, aren't you?" "Nye." Nye, a name only one person had ever called her. Niara's breath caught in her throat. No one knew that name. No one but Kale. Her hands clenched at her sides. It couldn't be. It shouldn't be. But as the Phantom turned away, stepping back into the shadows, Niara felt something deep inside her break free. She had to know the truth. Who was he? Princess Niara could not stop thinking about the Phantom's words. "You are still stubborn, aren't you?" Nye. No one had called her Nye in years. Only Kale used that name. But Kale was gone. He had disappeared when the war began. He could not be standing here as the Empire's greatest warrior. Could he? The ceremony had ended, and the Phantom had disappeared into the palace's guest chambers. Niara, still restless, walked through the stone corridors, her mind spinning with thoughts. She needed answers. The Phantom's presence. The Phantom was staying in the west wing of the palace, an area reserved for honored guests. Guards stood outside, watching closely. No one was allowed inside. Niara, however, was not just anyone. "I need to speak to him," she told the guards. They hesitated. The Phantom does not wish to see anyone. Niara narrowed her eyes. "I am the princess. Step aside." Reluctantly, the guards moved, allowing her to enter. The door was heavy, and as she pushed it open, she felt her heart race. Inside, the room was dimly lit. The Phantom stood near the large window, looking out over the Empire. His black armor reflected the light of the twin moons outside. "You should not be here," he said without turning around. Niara took a deep breath. Then tell me why you called me Ni. For a moment, the phantom said nothing. Then, slowly, he turned to face her. His helmet was still on, hiding his face, but she could feel his gaze burning into her. You don't remember me, do you? He finally said. Niara stepped closer. I remember someone. Someone who called me that name. But it cannot be you. The phantom's hands clenched into fists. Why not? Because Kale is dead, Niara whispered. He disappeared. He never came back. The phantom let out a slow breath. Maybe he never had the chance. Unanswered questions. Niara felt her heart pound. Was he saying what she thought he was? She took another step closer. Take off the helmet, she demanded. The phantom did not move. Take it off, she said again, her voice rising. Still, he did nothing. Niara's hands clenched. She had spent years mourning Kale, believing he was gone forever. But now, if there was even the smallest chance that he had survived, she needed to see for herself. Why are you afraid? She asked, her voice softer. The phantom remained silent. You won a war. You faced death on the battlefield. But now you stand before me and refuse to show me your face. Why? For a long time, there was only silence. Then the phantom turned away. Because I am not the boy you remember, he said. Not anymore. Danger in the shadows. Before Niara could say another word, a loud explosion suddenly shook the palace. The ground trembled beneath them. The window behind the phantom shattered as smoke filled the room. Niara stumbled, coughing. What? The phantom grabbed her arm and pulled her away from the window just as blaster shots came flying into the room. Assassins, he muttered. Niara's eyes widened. Someone is trying to kill you. The phantom drew a weapon from his side, a blade that crackled with energy. They've been trying for a long time. Through the smoke, figures in dark cloaks appeared at the entrance. Their weapons were drawn, ready to attack. Niara reached for the dagger at her belt. She was not a helpless princess. She had trained for battle since childhood. One of the assassins lunged at her. She ducked under his strike and drove her dagger into his side, sending him crashing to the floor. The phantom moved like a shadow, taking down the attackers with terrifying speed. His blade sliced through the air, and within seconds, the remaining assassins lay defeated. Breathing heavily, Niara looked at him in shock. You fight, just like Kale. The phantom stood still, his shoulders tense. You should go. It's not safe here. Niara grabbed his wrist. No, I'm not leaving until you tell me the truth. The phantom sighed. Tomorrow. I will tell you tomorrow. Niara hesitated but nodded. Then I will come back. As she left the room, her heart pounded. She would get her answers soon. But deep down, she already knew. The phantom was Kale. She just needed him to admit it. And why did he sound exactly like the friend she had lost? Princess Niara barely slept that night. The events of the evening kept repeating in her mind. The phantom's voice, his fighting style, the way he called her Ni. Everything pointed to one impossible truth. Kale was alive. She had spent years believing he was dead. She had mourned him, cried for him, and forced herself to move on. But now, a ghost from her past had returned, not as the boy she once knew, but as a hardened warrior who won a war. Morning came too soon. Niara dressed quickly and made her way back to the west wing of the palace, where the phantom was staying. Today, he had to tell her the truth. But when she reached the door, the guards blocked her path. The phantom left at dawn, one of them said. Niara's eyes narrowed. Where? The guard hesitated. The training grounds. A duel with a ghost. The imperial training grounds were a vast open space where warriors tested their skills. Niara arrived to find dozens of soldiers gathered, their eyes fixed on the center of the field. There, the phantom stood alone, facing 3 of the Empire's strongest warriors. The battle had already begun. Niara watched in shock as the phantom moved like a shadow, dodging and countering every strike with precision. His movements were too familiar, the same speed and technique Kale once had, but now sharpened by war. One of the warriors lunged with a blade, but the phantom sidestepped and disarmed him in a single motion. Another attacked from behind, but the phantom spun and kicked him to the ground. The final warrior hesitated before charging. The phantom ducked low, sweeping the warrior's legs and pinning him to the ground with his blade at his throat. The fight was over in seconds. The crowd was silent, then burst into cheers and whispers. No one had ever defeated three of the Empire's best so quickly. Niara felt her chest tighten. It was him. It had to be him. The phantom turned, as if sensing her presence. Without a word, he walked past the crowd, heading toward the gardens. Niara followed, the truth beneath the helmet. The gardens were quiet, away from the palace eyes and ears. Niara found him standing near the fountain, his back to her. She stepped closer. Enough running. The phantom did not move. You promised, she said, her voice steady. Tell me the truth. Slowly, he turned. Then, for the first time since he arrived, he lifted his helmet. Niara's breath caught. It was him, Kale. But he was not the same boy she remembered. His face was sharper, older, marked by scars of war. His eyes, once filled with mischief, now held shadows of pain. She took a shaky breath. Kale. He nodded. Tears burned in her eyes. You're alive. His jaw tightened. Yes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, anger rose in Niara's chest. Why didn't you come back? She demanded. Why did you let me believe you were dead? Kale looked away. Because the Kale you knew did die. The war took him. Niara clenched her fists. That's not an answer. Kale sighed. I was captured, Nye. The Empire abandoned me. No one came looking. I had to fight my way out. I became someone else. Niara shook her head. That's not true. I would have come for you if I knew. Kale's voice was calm but cold. You didn't know. No one did. She could see it now. The pain in his eyes. The weight he carried. The war had taken everything from him, and no one had been there to save him. She swallowed hard. Then why come back now? Kale hesitated. Because the war isn't over. A hidden enemy. Niara frowned. What do you mean? We defeated the enemy. Kale's gaze hardened. No. The real enemy is inside the Empire. Niara's stomach twisted. What are you saying? Kale's voice dropped to a whisper. The same people who left me behind are still in power. They wanted the war. They profited from it. And now, they want to silence me. Niara felt a chill run down her spine. The assassination attempt last night. Kale nodded. It wasn't just an attack on me. It was a warning. They don't want the truth coming out. Niara took a step closer. Then we need to stop them. Kale shook his head. No, you need to stay out of this. If you get involved, they'll come for you too. Niara lifted her chin. I don't care. Kale's eyes softened, just for a moment. You should. Niara reached out, placing a hand on his arm. You're not alone anymore, Kale. Whatever happens next, we face it together. Kale didn't answer, but for the first time, he didn't pull away. The war wasn't over. But neither was Kale and Niara's story. The air in the palace gardens felt heavy. The silence between Niara and Kale stretched, filled with unspoken words, unhealed wounds, and a past neither could erase. Kale, the phantom, the warrior who had won a war, stood before her. But to her, he was still the childhood friend she had lost, or at least what remained of him. You need to leave this alone, Kale said finally, his voice low. Niara narrowed her eyes. No, if there's a threat inside the Empire, I won't ignore it. Kale sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. This isn't your fight, Niara stepped closer. It is if it threatens my people. Kale held her gaze for a moment before turning away. The people you're trying to protect are the same ones who left me behind. Niara felt a sting in her chest. She couldn't deny it. The Empire had failed him. She had failed him. But that didn't mean she would abandon him now. The silent betrayal. Before Niara could respond, a rustling in the trees made both of them tense. Kale moved first, his instincts sharp as ever. He grabbed Niara's arm and pulled her behind him just as a blast of energy struck the ground where she had been standing. They were under attack. More energy blasts rained down as figures in dark cloaks emerged from the shadows. Assassins. Kale drew his energy blade in an instant. Niara pulled out her dagger. There was no time for questions. They had to fight. The first assassin lunged toward Kale, but he was faster. He sidestepped and knocked the attacker's weapon away, striking with precision. Niara blocked an incoming strike, twisting her blade and slashing across her enemy's arm. She wasn't just a princess, she was a warrior too. But the assassins kept coming. Too many. Kale growled under his breath. We can't fight them all. Niara's heart pounded. Then we run. Kale nodded. He grabbed her wrist, and they moved as one, weaving through the trees. Behind them, the assassins followed, their weapons lighting up the darkness. Escaped through the city. They reached the palace walls. But Kale didn't stop. Instead, he pulled Niara toward a narrow passage, hidden behind a stone pillar. What is this? Niara asked as they ran. Kale barely glanced back. A tunnel. Old, but still useful. Niara followed him inside. The tunnel was dark and damp, leading away from the palace. They ran for several minutes until Kale finally slowed, listening for signs of pursuit. Nothing. They had escaped. Niara leaned against the wall, catching her breath. You knew about this tunnel. Kale nodded. I spent years in this city, hiding, surviving. I know more about it than your father ever did. Niara studied him in the dim light. How much had he suffered while she had lived in comfort? She shook off the thought. Who were they? The assassins. Kale's expression darkened. People who don't want me alive. Niara exhaled. Then they're after me now, too. Kale's jaw tightened. That's why I told you to stay out of this. Niara lifted her chin. And that's why I won't. For a moment, Kale just stared at her. Then, to her surprise, he let out a short, breathy laugh. You're still the same, he murmured. Niara smirked. And you're still stubborn. Kale's eyes softened, but the moment was brief. His face hardened again. We're not safe here. We need to move. Niara nodded. Then where do we go? Kale hesitated before answering. To someone who has the answers we need. A dangerous alliance. They made their way through the hidden paths of the city, avoiding guards and patrols. Finally, Kale led her to an abandoned building on the edge of the marketplace. He knocked on the metal door in a strange pattern. 3 slow taps, 2 quick ones. A moment later, the door slid open, revealing a tall figure in a hooded cloak. Niara's eyes widened. She recognized this person. General Rilis, she breathed. Rilis, once a respected commander, had been exiled years ago for questioning the Empire's leadership. She had vanished after the war. Yet here she was. The general stepped aside. Come inside. We don't have much time. Niara turned to Kale. You trust her? Kale's voice was firm. She's the only one who knows the truth. Niara stepped inside. Whatever truth they were about to uncover, there was no turning back now. Niara followed Kale into the dimly lit hideout, her heartbeat still racing from the fight. The air inside was heavy with the scent of old metal and dust. General Rilis, once a trusted commander of the Empire, stood before them, her face hidden beneath a heavy cloak. She closed the door behind them and turned to Kale. I never thought I'd see you alive, she said, her voice calm but firm. Kale crossed his arms. I survived, but not because of the Empire. Niara stepped forward. You knew he was alive. she asked Rilis. The general nodded. I had my suspicions. The Empire doesn't leave survivors, unless it needs them. Niara frowned. What do you mean? Rilis sighed and pulled out a small device, pressing a button. A holographic map appeared in the air, displaying a secret military facility deep in the mountains. This is where the truth begins, Rilis said. Kale's expression darkened. I know that place. Niara looked between them. What is it? Rilis met her eyes. It's a hidden facility where the Empire experimented on prisoners of war, humans, and others they considered disposable. Niara felt a cold chill run down her spine. That can't be true. My father. Kale cut her off. Your father knew. Niara's breath caught. No, he wouldn't. Kale's gaze was sharp. He did, and when I was captured, that's where they took me. Niara staggered back, unable to believe what she was hearing. The Empire, the very people she had sworn to protect, had betrayed one of their own. You don't have to believe me, Kale said, his voice quieter now. But I lived it, and I wasn't the only one. Rilis shut off the hologram. The people who run that facility still hold power, and they'll do anything to keep their secrets buried, including killing Kale. Niara forced herself to stay calm. This was bigger than she had imagined. If this was true, then the Empire's war had been built on lies and cruelty. She looked at Kale. What do we do? Kale's jaw tightened. We expose them. The Emperor's deception. Niara knew this was dangerous. The moment they made their move, they would become traitors in the eyes of the Empire. But she had made her decision. That night, she returned to the palace, her mind racing. She needed to know if her father was truly involved. When she reached the throne room, the Emperor was already waiting. Niara, he said, his voice steady. You've been gone all day. Niara took a deep breath. I was gathering information. The Emperor's expression did not change. And what did you find? Niara hesitated. Father, is it true? Did the Empire experiment on human prisoners? For a brief moment, his eyes darkened. Then he smiled. You should be careful about what you believe, my daughter. That was not a denial. Niara's stomach twisted with unease. Then tell me it's not true. The Emperor stood, stepping down from his throne. You are a princess, Niara. Your duty is to protect this empire, not question it. Her hands clenched. If protecting the empire means hiding the truth, then I won't do it. The Emperor sighed. I hope you would not be foolish enough to follow that traitor. Niara stiffened. Kale is not a traitor. The Emperor's smile faded. Then you are making a dangerous mistake. The doors behind her opened. Guards stepped inside, their weapons drawn. Niara's heart pounded. Her own father had betrayed her, escaping the palace. Niara's mind raced. She was trapped. The guards moved forward, but Niara reacted first. She grabbed the nearest soldier's arm and twisted, knocking him off balance. Before the others could react, she sprinted toward the open window. Stop her, the Emperor ordered. Niara jumped. She landed on the lower palace balcony, rolling to absorb the impact. The guards above shouted, but she didn't stop. She ran through the gardens, dodging past more soldiers. The only person who could help her now was Kale. Reuniting with Kale, Niara reached the abandoned building, her breath ragged. She slammed the door shut behind her. Kale and Rilis were waiting. You're bleeding, Kale said, noticing a cut on her arm. Niara barely noticed the pain. My father knows. He tried to arrest me. Kale's expression hardened. Then there's no turning back. Niara looked at him. What's the next move? Kale turned to Rilis. We hit the facility. We take their records. Expose everything. We end this. Niara took a deep breath and nodded. Then let's finish what they started. Kale's eyes met hers, and for the first time, he knew she was truly with him. The fight was just beginning. Niara sat in the dimly lit hideout, her mind racing. She had betrayed her own empire. Or perhaps the empire had betrayed her first. The emperor, her father, had made his choice. He had tried to silence her, just as he had tried to erase Kale. Now, there was no going back. Kale stood across from her, checking his weapons. His movements were calm, controlled, but she knew him well enough to see the storm brewing beneath the surface. Niara broke the silence. "Are you sure this will work?" Kale looked up, his blue eyes unreadable. "It has to." The plan was simple, but dangerous. Break into the secret facility, steal the records, expose the truth to the entire empire. The problem: the facility was heavily guarded, and now the empire knew they were coming. General Rilis placed a holographic map on the table. The entrance is underground, hidden beneath the old ruins outside the capital. It's not on any official records. Niara studied the map. "How do we get in?" Kale pointed at a section of the structure. "There's a supply tunnel here. We use it to sneak in. Once inside, we split up. I'll get the records. You and Rilis cover me." Niara crossed her arms. "You really think I'm just backup?" Kale gave her a small smirk. "I think you're a fighter, but we need to be smart." Niara rolled her eyes but said nothing. Rilis checked her weapon. "We need to move now. The empire won't wait for us." Kale nodded. "Then let's go." Breaking in. The ruins were silent under the moonlight. The remains of an ancient fortress stood overgrown with vines, hiding the entrance to the facility below. Kale led the way, moving with silent precision. Niara followed, her heart pounding. They had one chance. If they were caught, they wouldn't get another. Rilis reached the hidden panel in the ground and pressed a sequence of buttons. The stone floor shifted, revealing a metal hatch leading underground. Niara exhaled. "Here we go." One by one, they climbed down into the darkness. Inside, the tunnels were cold and damp, the air thick with the scent of rust. Kale moved ahead, his weapon ready. Then a voice crackled in their earpieces, one of Rilis's spies. "You have 5 minutes. The guards just changed shifts. Go now." Kale didn't hesitate. "Move." They ran down the tunnel, every step bringing them closer to the truth. The truth revealed. They reached a security door, and Rilis worked quickly to hack the system. The door slid open, revealing rows of metal containers filled with classified records. Kale moved fast, scanning through files. "We need proof that the Empire used prisoners for experiments." Niara checked a nearby console. Her hands trembled as she opened one of the digital files. What she saw made her stomach twist in horror. Images of prisoners, humans, aliens, all taken against their will. Records of experiments done in secret. Names of officials who had ordered them. And at the bottom of the list, her father's name. Niara took a shaky breath. "It's all here." Kale's expression was unreadable. "Then let's take it." He inserted a data drive into the system, copying the files. The process was slow, too slow. Suddenly, an alarm blared. Niara's blood ran cold. "They know we're here," Kale muttered. Rilis pulled out her blaster. "We fight our way out." Niara grabbed her weapon, heart pounding. "Let's finish this." The battle begins. The doors burst open, and Imperial soldiers stormed in. Kale moved first, taking down a guard with a precise shot. Rilis followed, firing with deadly accuracy. Niara ducked behind cover as blaster fire filled the room. She returned fire, striking an enemy soldier. "Kale, how much longer?" she shouted. Kale gritted his teeth. "Almost done." More guards rushed in. Niara lunged forward, using her dagger in close combat. She twisted around an enemy, taking him down with a sharp strike. Kale finally yanked the data drive from the console. "Got it. Let's move." Rilis tossed a smoke grenade, and they ran through the cover of darkness. Guards chased after them, gunfire ringing through the tunnels. But they were too fast, too determined. They reached the exit and climbed up the hatch just as reinforcements arrived. Niara and Kale sprinted toward their ship, Rilis close behind. Then, a sharp pain shot through Niara's shoulder. She stumbled. Kale caught her. Niara. She gritted her teeth. I'm fine. Keep going. They reached the ship, and Rilis hit the controls. The engines roared to life. As they lifted off, Imperial forces surrounded the ruins below, but they were too late. The truth was no longer buried. The final move. Kale patched up Niara's wound as they flew through the night sky. She winced but managed a weak smile. Told you I could fight. Kale smirked. I never doubted it. Rilis checked the data drive. This is enough to bring the Empire to its knees. Niara took a deep breath. Then we release it. Kale met her gaze. Are you ready for what comes next? Niara nodded. Yes. The battle wasn't over. But for the first time, they had a chance to win. The ship flew through the dark sky, leaving the Empire's capital behind. Inside, Niara, Kale, and General Rilis sat in silence, catching their breath. The stolen data drive lay on the table before them, a tiny device holding the truth that could change everything. Niara's shoulder throbbed from the gunshot wound, but she barely felt it. Her mind was focused on one thing. What came next? Kale glanced at her. Are you sure you want to do this? Niara met his eyes. I have to. She had spent her whole life believing in the Empire's honor. But now she knew the truth. It was built on betrayal and lies. And she would no longer be part of it. Rilis activated the holo-communicator. We have the files. Now we send them to the entire Empire. Niara nodded. Let's finish this. The truth goes public. The ship's system connected to the Empire's main broadcast channels. Kale inserted the data drive, and Rilis began transmitting every document, every hidden file, every name involved in the experiments. Within moments, the entire Zelfar Empire was watching the truth unfold. Screens across the city flickered to life, showing classified footage of tortured prisoners, human and alien alike. People gasped in horror as they saw their own leaders involved in secret war crimes. The Emperor's name was listed among the guilty. The Empire's citizens, who once saw their rulers as noble, now saw them for what they truly were. Niara clenched her fists. Her father's lies were finally exposed. The Empire crumbles. The reaction was immediate. Riots broke out in the capital. Soldiers, once loyal to the Emperor, turned against him. The people no longer trusted their leaders. Palace officials tried to shut down the transmission, but it was too late. The files had already spread across the galaxy. Kale watched the chaos unfold from the ship's screen. It's over. Niara swallowed hard. No, it's just beginning. Her father would not surrender easily. He would try to hold on to power. And she knew exactly what he would do next. Kale, she said urgently, we need to go back. Kale frowned. Back? To the palace? Niara nodded. He won't step down. He'll try to take control again. We have to stop him. Kale sighed. I knew you were going to say that. Rilis crossed her arms. Then let's end this. The ship turned around, heading back to the capital. The final confrontation. When they arrived, the palace was already in chaos. Guards were fighting amongst themselves, some defending the Emperor, others siding with the people. Niara, Kale, and Rilis made their way inside, moving through the war-torn corridors. At last, they reached the throne room. The Emperor sat on his throne, his face cold and unreadable. He looked exactly the same, but now, Niara saw him differently. Her father was not a noble ruler. He was a man who had let greed and power destroy his soul. You shouldn't have come back, the Emperor said, his voice quiet but filled with anger. Niara stepped forward. You betrayed your own people. The Emperor stood slowly. I protected them. You don't understand what it takes to rule. Kale scoffed. You don't rule. You control. The Emperor ignored him. His eyes stayed on Niara. You had everything. A future, power, my love. And now you throw it all away for this traitor. Niara's heart ached, but she stood firm. Kale is not the traitor. You are. The Emperor's jaw tightened. Then you leave me no choice. He reached for his weapon, but Niara was faster. She grabbed her dagger, stepping forward, and knocking the weapon from his hands. The Emperor staggered back, looking at her with something almost like regret. But it was too late for that now. Guards rushed in, but this time, they weren't on his side. They aimed their weapons at the Emperor. The leader of the guards bowed to Niara. Princess, the people have spoken. The Emperor is finished. The Emperor's face hardened. He looked at Niara one last time. You think you've won? Niara held her chin high. No, I think the Empire has. The guards took him away. It was over. A new future. Niara stepped onto the palace balcony. Below, thousands of people gathered, watching, waiting. She took a deep breath and spoke. The Empire has been ruled by lies for too long. But today, we take back our future. We build a world of truth, not fear. A world where power belongs to the people, not those who abuse it. The crowd erupted into cheers. Kale watched from behind her, a small smile on his lips. You really are a leader. Niara turned to him. Stay. Help me rebuild this empire. Kale hesitated. I don't belong here, Nye. Her heart sank. Where will you go? Kale exhaled. There are still battles to fight. Still people who need help. That's where I belong. Niara felt a lump in her throat. Then this isn't goodbye. Kale smirked. No, just see you later. He stepped back, turning toward the ship. Niara watched as he walked away, her heart both heavy and hopeful. She would rebuild the empire. He would find his own path. But no matter where they went, they would always be connected. Because no war, no empire, no betrayal could ever erase what they once had.